Dublin, and hello, Anne O'Day. I cannot believe I'm not there. I feel like I'm absolutely missing out, but know that I've been watching all of the sessions and cannot thank you enough for the conversations that you continue to put forward for us all to benefit from. I'm going to do my best to look in my camera so you can all feel me there with you. I think these conversations are just so important for all of us, especially at this moment where we've all struggled for the last 2 years to connect and to really communicate with each other. A lot's happened since we last spoke at Astia. We raised our fund. We've done our first 5 investments. We have 10 to 12 more to go from the fund. And all of it is increasing our impact in the marketplace. What Anne asked me to speak to was the future of investment. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting on that as the last year has passed and we've emerged from the initial stages of the pandemic. And as we've emerged from having a fund at Astia, it's a very exciting time and a great time to reflect. I'm actually, for the first time, and you won't believe this, quite excited about the future of investment. For those of you who have seen me on stage before at what was InspireFest and is now Future Human, you'll know that I'm awfully critical of my industry. And I'm the first to stand up and say where its failings exist and where we could improve. And I'll do that today as well. But I do want to start with this premise that I feel quite hopeful for the first time. I feel like something that the pandemic has done is made us all more aware of ourselves as humans, more aware of ourselves as humans within the workplace. And I think Anne yesterday was talking about how it makes you closer to people when you see them in their living room or in their bedroom or with their children running behind them during a Zoom meeting. And certainly my own industry seems to have taken a moment to say, what is our intention? And it's that intentionality that I want to speak to today with you about the future of investing and why I think it looks bright. It starts with our own assessment at Astia, our own assessment of our own intentions. Because when you start to bring intention to investing, you have to ask about the unintended consequences. And that's just what we did at Astia this last 2 years with a program we call Astia Edge. And for those of you who want to learn more about it, there is a thought leadership paper on our website that you can download. But the title actually says it all: our failure to invest in Black founders and what we've done about it. Now, Astia Edge is a very humbling moment at Astia. It is a very initial and starting point, but it's one we're quite proud of and eager to share with you all and with the broader market. As you all know, we've been around for 20 years. Well, I say, as you all know, because you feel like family. Sorry, I come to your conference. I shouldn't be so, I shouldn't make such huge assumptions. But for over 20 years, Astia's mission has been to champion gender equity and inclusion in the venture capital landscape, and do this through investment in companies that include women. And we've always recognized that as investors, we had an obligation and a unique agency to lead change. But it wasn't until we took a pause and a beat and a moment at a dinner in 2018 that we actually found our own failure, and from that failure, a huge opportunity. You see, we had done this, what we thought a really exciting thing, which was to pull together the entrepreneurs that we had chosen to not invest in. They had made it through our highly selective and rigorous process that we call the Astia Expert Sift. We're very proud of the Sift and its performance. It has successfully, for 20 years, removed bias from our sourcing and screening process and from our investment consideration. And so we knew that the SIFT, year in and year out, was finding for us the best-in-class companies to invest in. And it was doing this through the wisdom of a community and through the expertise that they could lend in assessing businesses. And we knew that it was gender and racially neutral, and did a phenomenal job of sourcing companies that included women, and most notably women of color. And so it was at this dinner party for the companies that we had not invested in, but who had made it through the SIFT, that I was feeling quite smug about Astia's SIFT. You see, 80% of the dinner attendees were Black, and the vast majority of them were Black women. And so I was thinking, look at this great evidence that we're having this dinner with our best of the best companies, and they are incredibly racially inclusive. It took me about 10, maybe even 20 minutes while I was starting to eat my dinner and enjoy wine before my gut sank. It's the best way I can describe it. When I started to reflect on our actual investment portfolio. To my horror and my absolute disappointment, I could not think of a single Black woman within our portfolio. Here, sitting at the dinner, were the best of the best companies, but the ones we had not invested in. The dinner was so that we could reconnect with them, potentially invest, and we could continue to build a trusted relationship as an investor who might want to invest at a later point. I have to tell you that when that realization happened, in my 17-year journey at Astia, I've never felt such disappointment and such shock. But we didn't leave it at disappointment and shock. I turned to my colleague and we immediately began our work, and thus emerged what has now been published as our Astia Edge pilot. The next day, we went back to the team and started to look. We looked closely at our data, and sure enough, at every stage of the SIFT, race was not a deterrent to successfully passing through the SIFT. But what we did find was that at the point of investment, at that final, investors often call it gut check, what was happening at Astia was probably what was happening at venture firms around the globe. That final check-in, do you trust this entrepreneur? Do you believe this entrepreneur? Can you get on board with this entrepreneur? And it was there that we were able to track our problem at that very personal moment. And we had to own it organizationally. So we set out to deal with the fundamentals of that meeting. What questions did we ask? What were the thoughtful considerations brought to that meeting and conversation? And we started to add the rigor of consistency of questions and consistency of conversation to that meeting. Something we had done at every stage of the SIFT prior to that meeting, but we had not taken the time to do at the meeting. And I'll give you an example. We noted that for our white female CEOs, we had asked questions about the potential of the business. Where was it going? What did its future look like? What was the promise of the future and the promise of the business through this team? Unfortunately, our questions with Black women were not so generous. They tended to be questions about what had or had not been achieved. Why weren't things pursued? Why were opportunities not yet realized? And they were more critical of a history of the business than excitement about the future of the business. It's interesting how conversation can do that. How conversation can insert in the most subtle ways unintended bias. And what we seek to do in Astia Edge is turn our unintended bias into very intended action. And so with the simple acknowledgement that we were the problem, and it was our obligation and our unique agency as investors to change the conversation, we changed our questions. In addition, we took a look at what happens to those entrepreneurs, not just within Astia, but what happens to those Black CEOs, most notably female CEOs, with other investors. And the findings from the pilot demonstrate that significant bias exists in the investment landscape, and it's fully baked in. It's not so individual as me, it's far more systemic as us. First, investor bias creates a significant barrier for these companies. And what do I mean by that? We saw that our pilot companies took on average 60 outside investor introductions by Astia to complete the syndicate. So even when we were prepared to invest, we had to commit to 60 conversations with other investors to finish out the round. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you entrepreneurs who are out there raising, and you think 60 conversations is nothing. But I'll tell you that when Astia calls an investor for our other companies, on average, it's 5 of those calls. We were shocked. Well beyond our own commitment to invest, the broader market's commitment to invest was lacking, and we needed to be aware, and we needed to be willing to take on the work of the 60 calls. So what we found next was that pairing our investment with advocacy was key, because those 60 calls don't just happen, you must intend them. If they're not your normal course of things, you need to commit to them. We found that deals with Black female CEOs required an atypical effort from the Astia team to get the deal across the line. Everything from getting the right law firm engaged, getting the right financial story communicated, getting the right other investors on board. And it was this advocacy that was a learning for us. Next was the broader systemic inequities. One of the companies in our pilot, just as an example, but very representative of all, raised their first 2.5 million from 93 investors. For those of you who have raised money for your business, you'll know that that's an astonishingly high number of individual investors. And herding cats, as it were, those number of investors is cumbersome, labor intensive, and inefficient. Once again, looking at our broader portfolio, companies at the same stage that were not led by Black female CEOs had far fewer investors, and therefore the entrepreneurial grit required of our Black female CEOs was substantially higher and more demanding on their time and effort. And what we needed to do as investors was commit to navigating those 93 others who were in the deal. In addition, we found that those pilot companies averaged 245 days to close versus 161 for the normal company. And by normal, I mean non-Black female CEOs. So we had to redefine what was normal within the Astia processes. And we had to be okay that deals that take longer, sometimes take longer for no reason other than systemic barriers. And it might be that the deal is still a great deal to do. And it was our obligation to be patient through those days and stay committed to doing the deal. What we've done out of our EDGE learnings is we've created a model for impact that is a great starting point. And once again, I have to say, Astia was completely humbled by this process, and we acknowledge that this is just the beginning of our work. But as I said, it gives me great hope for a future of intentional investing. Number one, we committed to investing. That is the only measure of an investor. How many Black female CEOs do we have in the portfolio? And I'm proud to say that as of today, 25% of the companies post Astia EDGE pilot have been run by Black female CEOs. Within the fund, 2 out of the 5 female CEOs are Black women. They are exceptional, they are phenomenal, and they absolutely deserved our investment. And it was our obligation and our agency to change our ability to invest. Number 2, advocacy. We got the deals fully funded. By the time the fund invested in both Candescent and Goalsetter, we knew that our work to make sure that other investors knew about these very exciting companies was the work at hand. It was not nice to do, it was a must do. And that advocacy will endure long beyond our investing. It's our obligation to make sure the market hears of the success of these entrepreneurs and our success as investors in investing in them. And then the final prong to this work, as it were, we call access. And that's our obligation and agency, once again, to ensure that these companies have equal access. And where there are barriers to relationships that can prove fruitful for their business, it sits on us to ensure that those doors are opened. It's interesting when one talks about agency. We're often ready to be critical of what is or is not happening in the market without recognizing our own agency to create change. What's truly exciting for me as I look forward into the innovation landscape is how many of us have agency to do something different and to make the world better reflected within the innovation economy. To start with, we as GPs, fund managers, investors, we have the agency to choose to have a portfolio that is inclusive of men and women and men of color. And it is exciting to know that those deals are out there. Black women in particular are starting businesses at 15 times the rate of their white male counterparts. This is not a pipeline issue. It's our obligation and agency as investors to change the construction of our portfolios through a very intended set of actions. Entrepreneurs, you have agency. You can look at your teams as you build them. If you don't bake in inclusion at the earliest stages of a startup, it is much harder to do it later. I would actually argue that once you hit 50 people within a company, it is impossible to change the construction of the individuals within a company. It's why still today large corporations struggle with their diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. But if you, the entrepreneur, at the early stages, recognize your agency and bake inclusion into your intention of your business, you will see a different innovation future. And then the final comment is about those limited partners, those who invest in the funds and who make venture capital possible. They absolutely have agency by demanding not just that there are GPs of color, but the fundamental underlying portfolios reflect the humanity and the human spectrum that we all represent. And the beautiful part for LPs is their agency can be about returns. Because what we know about these companies that are led by women and led by people of color is that they outperform in the marketplace. And so LPs have the greatest agency of all. They can look us in the eyes as investors, and they can look us in the eyes as entrepreneurs and remind us of the data that we seem to have struggled for 20 years, at least in the full 20 years of Astia, to recognize and act upon. That performance is a directly linked to the inclusion of the team. For those of you who have seen me on stage before at this phenomenal conference in Dublin, you know this is my mantra. That for us as investors, the obligation is huge. It's about performance, but equally it's about the future we intend and the future we fully support. I'm grateful to have been able to share this conversation again with you today, and I cannot thank you enough for reconvening us here. And next year, I look forward to being back in person. I wish you all well, and I encourage you all, find your agency and make the world you seek be possible within the companies you lead, the funds you invest, and the world you interact with. Be well.